I've seen so many articles. I've read so many things about people talking about what happened at the Kabul airport, and they weren't there. If you weren't there, you don't know what the story was. And so the heroic nature of the service these young men and women that displayed on the airfield, that has not gotten out yet. The differences in story that would hit the media, it was all wrong. But I don't know how anything got out anyway, because we were told at the start that the media wasn't allowed in Kabul. The entire 17-day operation, the only media that I saw, I think, was Al Jazeera, and the Taliban brought them in. So when we left Kabul and we got back to Kuwait before we came back to the States and redeployed, we started to see this whole operation getting, happy talked away with the Armed Forces Network commercials that would come on, the AFN. Those commercials would talk about these Afghans coming off these C-17s at airfields, and everybody was happy and everybody was nice. And they would get their little bag of juice and food, and they would go in a nice, orderly manner. Well, that's not the way Kabul was. So it has really not gotten out the amount of combat that was on that airfield for the entire operation. It hasn't gotten out that the firefights that we had with the Taliban prior to us, literally the day prior to us getting told that now we're friends with the Taliban and we're going to partner with them. Yep. That was an order that we stood post with the Taliban on our gates. You want to talk about frustrating? You try fighting people for 20 years of your career, and then the last operation, you fight with them one day, and then the next day you're told you're standing post with them.
I can't imagine that.
I was in the operations center when we got past that, and I just shook my head, and I had to go outside and smoke a cigarette. It was baffling to me that we were being ordered to do that. And one, Taliban fighter, he appeared from a door of the civilian terminal. He was on like a loading dock that was higher than the crowd. And when he was firing his, AK in the air, and once that AK started to get leveled, one of our Marines, shot him. And then I shot a second guy. And then at that point, two squads that were right in front of us, my battalion commander is right next to me. Two squads right in front of us, they then engaged the other. I think there were 3 or 5 more Taliban fighters inside of that loading dock. They engaged for a few seconds. They did exactly what they were trained to do. Then they shut down the fire. They ceased it. And at that point, we had several dead Taliban and no civilians were injured. They shot through the crowds before the crowds were able to get down. They acted absolutely perfectly. All those young fighters did. And that was just one day. Now, the next day, when the airfield gets quelled, going into the next night, well, now we get told that we're standing post with the Taliban. So the people that we were just shooting at and shooting at us, now we're going to stand post with. The weird part was those of us that grew up fighting these people and fighting this, those of us that came in right around the early 2000s. I came in when it was still peacetime in 99. Some came in, later than that. We've got a bunch of young bucks in 1st Battalion, 8th Marines that had never been in combat before, right? So a lot of the combat proficiency in all the armed forces has kind of left. Now we're all older. So it's not just our feelings about that order to partner with the Taliban on the gates, but how do we relay this to the young guys that know nothing about seeing news reports their entire childhood about us fighting them? So getting us to sell that order to the young guys on the gates and just telling them, like, listen, just do it. We'll talk about it later. And to keep that peace and to keep the operation going for the next 14 days until the evacuation was called to a stop and we started to get U.S. forces out of Kabul. Before we could leave, things like the day before we left, we were ordered to start cleaning up the base because the Taliban didn't think it was clean enough for them to take possession of. So before we left Afghanistan, we literally got told on by the Taliban.
And so you had to clean up for the Taliban, the people that you'd been fighting against for all those years.
Yeah, they told on us that we were too dirty.
That's insane.
There was too much trash. There was too much on the base. So we spent the next day cleaning up because the Taliban said so.
That must have just felt like a huge slap in the face.
Yes, to put that mildly, right? You could put a bunch of different kind of terms to that, but yeah, go tell that to the young kids.
Oh
You
my.
just fought your hearts out for 17 days. You haven't slept in 3 days, but before you can get some sleep, go clean up that trash
Go clean for your
because the
enemies.
Taliban said so.
Insane. Do you feel like domestic, like mainstream news, was trying to kind of paint this? Well, I mean, I guess we can only speculate their motivations, but they were basically giving the impression that this was much more peaceful, much more seamless of a operation than what you were experiencing on the ground.
Well, I think it comes to the political affiliation of the news system, right? So if it was a Democrat channel, they didn't try to say it was going great. And if it was like Fox News, they try to say that it was a disaster of withdrawal. To this day, you'll still hear some people talk about the disaster of the withdrawal. Well, maybe at certain levels, you might consider it that. That's way above the level that I was at. I know with the people that I was with in 1st Battalion, 8th Marines, from the top to the bottom, the battalion commander to our lowest private, there has not been a situation or not been a scenario in the 20 years that I've been in and out of combat that the old adage of uncommon valor was a common virtue fits more than the operation in Kabul with the evacuation.
How civilians like myself understand this? Because it seems like it would be very difficult fighting and pushing back and things like that. People that were desperate to get away from who you understood to be who you were really fighting, the Taliban, and be the enemies. I mean, gosh, I just can't imagine the emotional conflict with all of that happening. What was that like?
So the emotions didn't run rampant at that point, right? So we had a mission, keep the runway open. At
Gotcha.
that point, the runway was not open. So we went out, we spent all night pushing this crowd back over. Yes, there were some families in there, but there was a lot of single men in there, military age men, like Afghan national soldiers, like Afghan
Mhm.
army soldiers trying to get out of the country.
Right.
So we had to push them back. I believe with that Taliban checkpoint to the south, I believe that the Taliban went around that night and actually drove them to the airport. I think the Taliban was trying to get us to kill a bunch of civilians so then they could be the heroes.
Hmm.
And we never did.
Wow.
And the order was numbers. The order was get numbers. Once the order was get numbers, well, that's when the Department of State consulates stopped checking anything. And if
Mm.
you got through the gate, you went to the terminal and you got on a plane
Wow. So there were cases that people were just not being vetted at that point because they were trying to get the numbers up.
for days. And it depended on the day. And sometimes it depended on the hour, whether we were getting the numbers that were expected or not.
In hindsight, have you had any concern now that you're back home about who was able to make it here and if they were properly vetted? Did you raise any eyebrows as you were filling up those planes, or was just that not your thought at the time?
No, we were raising some eyebrows when we saw people coming through the gates. The amount of military age males that made it through the gates, single military age males that made it through the gates, that got a free ticket here, it definitely raised some eyebrows. When you get any combat veterans around, you talk about military age males, that's when the eyebrows get raised. So towards the end, we started to screen again, and some people were then ushered back out. A lot of military age males were ushered back out at the beginning, but many, many more made those flights. Some single men would get through the gates and then say, "Oh, my family is 300 meters back in the crowd." And it's great, go get them. We can't go out in the crowd to get them because we start a riot every time we try to do that.
Wow.
So we're like, great, go get them. And almost to a man, a few went back out in the crowds to get them. Almost to a man, they left their family in the crowd and they went to the airport to get on a plane. So the true amount, I don't think we'll ever know, but I would estimate in the thousands of military age males that made it onto those planes is definitely eye raising.
So do you have concerns that there's just no borders right now?
Yes. Absolutely. So wasn't it like, I don't know, when Obama was in office, he started talking about how we need to secure the southern border, and now the entire blue side of the aisle is saying open border. I don't know how weird that is, but I think with the southern border especially, we are just allowing criminals, rapists, murderers, drug cartels. I think I saw a news report. There was, I don't know, like 40 Chinese that were caught entering in the southern border. Why are we allowing our next enemy to enter through our country, through our borders? We already brought in almost like an enemy army, from Afghanistan. It has the possibility of being that,
Mhm.
right? If not an army, at least, many different, type of terrorist fighters. But we're allowing more through the southern border. I don't understand what this is all about. We have fought to secure this homeland. And I think that if anybody supports the southern border being open, you need to rewind the clock. You need to remember how you felt. Maybe you need to watch a video again of the towers falling on September 11th, because that's what's going to happen. Our next 9/11 is on the way, and we're allowing the people right now to come in this country to do it. That's what I believe.